I have my color flat grid created on artboard number 1 on the left. I have my grayscale grid completed, artboard number 2 on the right. I'm done with artboard 2. I'm not going to make any more changes on that grayscale grid on this project. So I've selected it and hit Command 2 or Object Lock selection up here in the menu. So I'll leave that one alone. But now with these flat colors, this is kind of fun, but I'm going to go next step. I'm going to add some gradients and create some custom gradients. So the first thing I'm going to do is click on this grass, and I'm going to make it lighter in the foreground and darker in the background. Darker values recede, lighter values advance. And I have selected that and hit G. And so when I do that, G is the gradient tool. If I just have it selected, you'll see it's just the regular bounding box and radius points. So I have that selected. I hit the letter G for gradient tool. Or here's another thing you could do. You could go to Essentials and go to Essential Classics, and you'll see there's a lot more control panels in this one. I'm going to work in Essential Classics now. So I have this grass selected. I'm going to hit the letter G, or come over here. You see I have more tools showing as well. Here's the gradient tool. I'll click that, and this little guy pops up. It's called the gradient annotator. And right now you'll see it's showing up as a gradient from green to green. And if I want to change that, I can do that here on the gradient annotator, or I can come over here to the gradient control panel. I'll open that up. And if I want to pull that out and just have it floating, I can do that as well. So there's the gradient control panel. There are 3 types of gradients. There's a linear gradient, and that's just like the icons show here. It's just a straight gradient. And there's a radial gradient and then a freeform gradient that we won't get to today. We'll do both linear and freeform. So I can change this gradient by clicking on this icon here, and I've got this green grass, and maybe I want to add a little darker to it. And you'll see now I've got lighter and darker. Am I happy with that? I'll click off of that. Maybe I want the grass in the foreground to have a little more yellow. I'll double click on this one. Yellow's already all the way up. I'll just knock the blue down a little bit, so then it's a little more yellow in the front. And here's how the gradient tool works. That's a linear gradient. It's a straight up and down line. If I pull the gradient on an angle, you'll see this on the gradient annotator. This is where that light color is. This is where the dark color is. So whatever way, if I pull it very short area, it's doing that full gradient in just this little area. And then everything in this instance to the left of that linear gradient is going to be this color. If I were to move that, everything to the right will be that color. Everything to the left is the other color. I can expand that by stretching it. And as I do that, I need to stretch it more so it gets beyond my guy there. If I do that, then it will change that. There's also a little midpoint here, this little diamond, and you see it right here as well. When I do that, I'm going to go ahead and pull it vertically because that's what I want it to end up. If I move this little diamond, see what happens in my gradient. This is the midpoint. By default, it will always be right in the center. If I pull it all the way to the bottom, you see I have dark all the way down. If I pull it more to the top, you see my light color goes, and I can move it either here on the gradient control panel or on the gradient annotator right here. And so I'm pretty happy with that. I like that, and I'm going to leave it that way. And there I have some nice dimensionality on the grass. I'm going to move to the next step here, and let's say I want to save that gradient. That's a nice gradient here. I'm going to go to my swatch palette here, and I'll open my swatches, and then I'm going to just drag that gradient I've made over to my swatch palette. And you see right now there's only this gray gradient, kind of sunset gradient, and then a gradient with transparency. I'm going to pull that. Wherever I pull it, it will save it. I'll pull it. And there I have a new gradient swatch. If I want to name that swatch, I can double click on it, and I'll call this grass gradient. Okay, so now I have a grass gradient here. And I just noticed something funny happened with my gradient here. I'm going to select that again and hit G for the gradient, and at some point I made my gradient be horizontal. No problem. I'll just redo that and pull. So now I have a gradient the way I want, and if I accidentally click a different color gradient, I can always come back here since I saved that grass gradient and change that color. So I'm happy with that. I'm going to hit V for my selection tool, and I'm going to select this water now. And so I have all of those shapes selected. If you're not sure they're selected, you can pull them over and then hit Command Z to undo. And so now I want to have that same kind of thing happen with the water. And so I'm going to go to my gradients. I'll click on just this gray gradient, and look what well, I actually clicked on this gradient. I'll click on the gray one here, and look what happens. I have separate gradients on all of them. If I get my gradient tool and pull with them all selected, you'll see what happens. That gradient will show various gradient annotators, but it will pull them all across. So I'm going to, on this gradient, I'll make this be, I'll pick the blue swatch here. I'll make this, this is a pretty watercolor here, and then that's color is good, and then I'm going to double click this one. I'll click maybe a darker blue, that's pretty, and maybe I want that just a little bit darker still. I'll double click on that swatch there, and I'll pick my little color palette here, and you see you have CMYK sliders. I think I'll just add a little black to that one as well. And so when I'm happy with that, then there's what my gradient looks like, and I can, whichever way I click and drag, it's going to create that gradient. And so I'm pretty happy with that, and I think I'll maybe want to save that gradient as well, and I'll just pull that, and then it will save that swatch as well. And it looks like I had one swatch that fell apart. I'll try that again. I'll pull that gradient across for all, and there. Now they're all on the same gradient. Now I'm going to add some radial gradients on. I'll do one more linear gradient. I think I want a different gradient for my sky, and I'll do a G for gradient, and then I'm going to, I have this water gradient already selected, and I'm not going to want to do that same one, but I'll maybe click on this and get a lighter sky in the top, and then I'll click on that and get I'll pull these sliders. And here's a fun thing with the CMYK sliders or RGB sliders. You see I have 70 and 15. If I want just a lighter value of that, I'll hold Shift, and as I move this slider, you'll see it moves the magenta slider. So whichever one I click on, if I click on the magenta slider and move it, it's going to move magenta and blue. If I move the cyan slider, it's going to move cyan and magenta. And it will move until the magenta just disappears. And I think that's a pretty sky. It's a nice gradient. I'm happy with that. I can move those individually as well. Maybe if I wanted more pink on the bottom, that's pretty. And maybe I'll make my blue a little bit less. So I have a gradient like that. I get kind of a good color in the middle, and if I wanted to add, say, a different color, maybe, oh, I like that. Maybe I want it to become a little more sunset-like. I'll move this slider down, and as I click on these sliders, so you see it will duplicate. If I duplicated a slider and I didn't want it, I can just click and drag down and throw it away. So I think what I'm going to do now is make this one here darker, so I'll add a little magenta to it, a little black to it, and you see that's, as I change it here in the settings, it's changing it on the top as well. So I'll add a bunch of magenta to give me a deeper sky, and a little bit of black, so I have a deep sky. I'm happy with that. Now I'll come over to my one here, and I think I'm going to add something lighter on the bottom. So I'll click there and drag, and if it doesn't duplicate, you just hold Option to duplicate, and I'll make this one a little bit brighter now. See, that's happening. And then this last one, I think I'll add a little yellow to that, like it's becoming sunset, and that's pretty. Maybe just a touch more magenta and a little less cyan, or no cyan at all. And there I have a pretty sunset. And so when I'm happy with that, you see my gradient here, I'll just pull it from the gradient swatches over here, and I'll double click on that and name that swatch something, or click on new swatch, and then I'll call, that's just going to be a process color swatch, that won't be the gradient swatch. So there I have a swatch, and there I double click on it, and I'll call this blue sunset. And there I have a save swatch. So I've got a couple of gradients I've saved. And there's linear swatches. Those are pretty nice, but I want to have some radial. And so this is where we can get a little bit of cheat on this project. I want like an iris and a pupil on this eye. So his eye right now is filled with this blue color here. I'm going to start off by just hitting the eyedropper and clicking right here because I already have something built that I can build off of. So now he has this sunset gradient. Well, that's not really the gradient I want, but also I want it to be a radial gradient. So I'm going to click radial gradient right here in the gradient swatch control panel, and you see what it did. I'm going to zoom up on that so you can see that eye better. Now, if I hit G for the gradient tool and pull from this point, you see what that's doing for his eye. And so what I want to do is I want to have a white of his eye here, or maybe I want to have, I'll have that be black right there. Give myself a little line. And when I'm happy with that, then this one here, I will have that one be just white. So I'll click white there. So now he's got just a gray eye with some pink here. And then for my next one here, notice it's this gray and this white are, it's black and it's white and it's creating gray. Well, I don't want to have gray eyes. I want to have just a little bit of a line. So I'm going to move that right up next to this one here. So I have black and gray almost right on top of each other. It creates a line there. So I don't have that gray anymore, but now I have white to magenta here. I'm going to move this purple color. I'm going to move that up a little bit, and I'm going to tell that to be blue. So now it has a blue eye, and so I could do a couple things. I could duplicate this white here, or I can move this slider right here, either this triangle here, and it corresponds with this one here. So either way, I'll do it right here on the gradient control panel, and I'll slide that pretty much right on top of each other. And you see now I have a white of his eye, and then lastly, I'll give him a pupil here. So I'll click black there, and it's a milky pupil. So what I'll do is I will click on that and slide it, and so there's a pupil. And then I have this gray color here that's not pretty, but how I'll fix that is slide that over, and then get those as close as they can be together. Or I can do this. I can duplicate this blue and just pretty much put them right on top of each other. And then he's got an eye, he's got eye color, he's got a white of his eye. If I want to slide that down, I can do this. If I want to add another swatch here, I can put them right on top of each other and get a harder line. So I've created, he's a little bit cross-eyed now, but he's got a pupil, an iris, and a white of his eye. You know, if I want to put that somewhere else, I can move this around. I can pick the whole slider and move it and see what that's doing. So his eye is moving around. That's kind of fun. And maybe I don't want to have it so cross-eyed, so I'll move that up a little bit so he's just looking forward. And then if I want to make this more elliptical, I can pull these sliders here, bigger, smaller, and so you have a lot of control on the shape of this as well. So, but I don't want to have a squishy iris, so I'll make that back round. I'll make it a little bit bigger, and I'll just grab that slider and move it up a little bit. In the meantime, I've lost that black. I decided that doesn't matter so much to me. I'd rather have him not be cross-eyed. So there we go. I'm pretty happy with that eye, and I could save this. I'll pull that gradient over to my swatches, and I'll name that swatch eye. I just double click on it on the swatch, and now I have a swatch name eye. So if I were to click on this tree and click the eye, well, I've got eyes in the trees. I don't really want to have that, but I do want to have some dimensionality on these trees. So what I'll do for them is I'm just going to select this square here, and I'll hit eyedrop. I'll pick that grass, and I'll tell it to be a radial gradient, and then I'll get the gradient tool, and I'll just move this gradient around to see what I'm getting. And I think I want to have the light on the edge, not the dark. So what I can do in my gradient control panel here, see right here I have reverse gradient, and I'll click that, and you see what it did. It made the dark on the other side and the light on the other side. So now I have light on the top and dark, and I'll get my gradient tool and just click and drag, or if I can click and drag the other way, and then I can move that gray over. So now I have a little bit of light on the edge and then dark. And then maybe I'll do the same thing with this one. I'll select that. I'll hit eyedropper, and it's not doing the same exact thing. I could, if I wanted, if I wanted that same exact, rather than pull the gradient again, I could just duplicate that shape over, but I'm happy to play around with this one. So I'll click and drag the other way. That's what I wanted it to do. Then I can move that shape around. There I have a little bit of nice dimensionality. So that's fun. And I'll just do the same thing with this one. I'll do the same thing with these two. And then I'll come in individually. I'll select each one and then hit G for gradient tool, pull that gradient to where it's what I want. I'm going to try to align those two. Did a pretty good job. I'll try to, oops, went the wrong way. I'll pull the other way. Probably I want this to come from the center. I'll try again until it's roughly aligning with this one. And then I've got another one. So now my tree has some nice dimensionality. It's got some gradients. It's a little more interesting. I could do that. Maybe I'll do that. If that was one separate square, I may do it on that one as well. So that's nice, some custom gradients. And then on this one, I probably wouldn't want to have it exactly like those. I can grab this gradient and slide it. I can switch the direction of the gradient. And maybe I want to have a little bit of light in the middle of that. And so that's fun. I like that tree. A useful tool you can use, I've shown you on the gradient, when you select shapes, you may have, maybe these two shapes are totally adjacent. I hit G for the gradient tool, and I pulled those at the same time. But you'll see you get multiple gradient annotators, and that can be confusing if you have a whole bunch. You can combine shapes if they're adjacent and touching. So I'm going to select these shapes here on this water, and you can see I've got various gradient annotators, and hide it just to make sure they were all selected, and then unhide it. So if I hit Shift M, that will give me the Shape Builder tool. And the Shape Builder tool is pretty fun. If you have the object selected, it will combine shapes. You just drag through them. You see it highlights them and turns them into one shape. So I'm going to hit V for the selection tool, and you see that's all one shape now. When I go to outline mode, you see it doesn't have the dividers in it. And so that's handy. I'll click my water gradient here. I'll hit G for gradient, and as I pull it up, you see it's only got one gradient annotator. It doesn't have all those multiple gradient annotators. So you can combine shapes if you have adjacent touching shapes. Just a caveat to that, if there is even just a sliver between two shapes where they don't touch, there's just a little gap, it will not combine them. So that's the Shape Builder tool, Shift M. You can use that if that helps you, and that might be useful if you're struggling with the gradient tool. And now I'm gonna work on this a little bit more. I'll speed this up and go to a finish, but all I'm doing is adding gradients to add a little bit of dimension and to add some more pizzazz to this piece. And now I'm happy with my color version. I've got some custom gradients here. Maybe I would want to play a little bit with the mustache. I could use some gradients there. The next step would be to add graphic patterns to that.